Good morning. Welcome to our Bible class together. We're studying today James chapter 5, the first 6 verses, on a very important problem that we all have in our society, one that we may not even be aware of. But let's listen to what James says about it. So I want to ask you a question to begin. How much is needed to be considered rich? That's not an easy question to answer. After all, think about it. If you had $1 million but somebody else had $10 million, who's rich? Now, I understand that in some way we're all rich, but it's always going to be comparative. If you have someone who has $1 billion and someone has $1.1 billion, the difference can be startling to those people who are reporting that number out. For instance, there are a lot of lists available in our society. Forbes keeps a lot of them, a Forbes 400 list of the 400 richest people, but the most important is the list of the billionaires, and all the regular people are there, like Jeff Bezos, the chairman and founder of Amazon. And you look at those lists, and the people have so much money, you go, what can anybody do with that? And it's become very important to them. The same is true about Forbes. They have a 400 richest people in America list. Now that creates some problems for some people. Wilbur Ross was the Commerce Secretary for a while for Donald Trump and his administration. Wilbur Ross was a successful businessman, but he wanted you to believe something else. He apparently, according to a Forbes writer who delved into it and wrote about it in the magazine, he said that Ross reported two different values of his wealth. One, the accurate one, he reported the Internal Revenue Service because he didn't want to be audited and be accused of falsifying a tax return. But the other, which was much higher and much inflated, he reported to Forbes. And the reason was very simple. He needed to show that he had enough that he could make the list of one of the 400 richest people in America. It was the envy of wanting to be on that list that created the problem of lying about what he was worth. Now, we might see that as petty, but also think about this. What is it that makes you rich? Is it the ability to buy certain things? For instance, there is a watch called the Romain Jerome Titanic Day and Night No. 2 watch. It is a watch. Now you may say, what's so special about this watch? It's made of pure silver, number one. It's very exclusive and very few of them are made, and that makes them more valuable. This is a watch that sells for $250,000. There's one interesting part of this watch. It will not tell you the time. You know why? Because if you can afford this watch, you don't need to know the time. You can ask somebody who is a servant to tell you the time. Perhaps that's a good definition of rich as well. But it's a problem. How do you determine who's rich? And James wants to warn those who are rich and who consider themselves rich and who show themselves rich. He says in our lesson today as he begins, now listen, rich people. He grabs them by the lapels and shakes them and says, you need to understand something about what's happening in your life. What is it that James wants to warn the rich about? And how do you know if you're rich? We tend to read the Bible and think that God disdains riches at all, that he condemns rich people for their riches. After all, you read in places like 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3 and the qualifications for elders that they are not to be lovers of filthy lucre. Listen to those words, filthy lucre. Doesn't that leave a tainting, a sense of dirtiness to wealth and to riches? And so we assume that if someone is rich, they're not righteous. But just because a person is rich doesn't mean they are wicked, as the same way that just because a person is poor doesn't make them kind automatically. They're not really related. Because when you read the whole Bible, you find riches everywhere. A lot of people are rich. A lot of good people. A lot of righteous people. A lot of people who are commended by God are rich. For instance, Abraham. Now we have this assumption that Abraham is this poor nomad who wanders around, who has absolutely nothing. And there's some of that to be true. He didn't own any property in Palestine. But that didn't mean he was poverty-ridden. In fact, in Genesis chapter 13, there is this difficulty between he and Lot because their flocks have gotten so large that there's not grazing land anymore. And there's fights that are breaking out among the shepherds because they're vying for good pasture land. And it says of Abram, it says, Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and in gold. Now this is Abraham we're talking about. We're not talking about Simon Legree. We're not talking about a Scrooge. We're talking about Abraham, the father of the faithful. And it says he was very wealthy. He's not condemned for being wealthy. It just happened to be a status of life. Or what about Job? Now Job is this righteous man who has to go through this intense suffering and learn some lessons from God. But think about Job. We know he's righteous. But listen to what it says about Job. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was a wealthy man. It wasn't he was dirt poor and that's why he was righteous. And it wasn't that he was righteous, he was rich because he was righteous. He happened to be righteous and rich. They were not mutually exclusive. And the same could be said about Solomon. Now, a lot could be read about Solomon's wisdom and about his wealth. But perhaps it's captured best in 2 Chronicles chapter 9. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues brought in by the merchants and traders. And also the kings of Arabia and the governors of the territories brought gold and silver to Solomon. Now the only way I could describe Solomon is he is just dripping in riches. He has more riches than a man could ever think. He has more riches than a country could ever think about using and utilizing. And yet the reason he was rich was because God had given him the wisdom that helped him become rich. He was not condemned for being rich. He had some other problems, but that wasn't due to his riches. Then why in the world do we think that riches is the problem? It's because we're missing the point. There's a spiritual principle that flows through Scripture that we probably miss on a regular basis. And here it is. It's not an object that is wrong. What makes something wrong is what it does to you spiritually. The effect on your soul determines the spiritual value of something. Think about almost anything. Suppose you have a problem with food and gluttony becomes a difficulty. Is the problem food, or is the problem what it does to you in the volumes you eat it spiritually? What about possessions? You just love fancy things, but the more fancy things you have, the less you give credence to God. What about status and position and power and the corner office? If you slight God to get those things, it's not the status is the problem, it's what it's doing to you. And the same is true about wealth and about riches. Riches, as we have seen through the people who are righteous but who are rich, that's not the problem. The problem is the effect they have on your spiritual life. When they get in the way, that's the problem. They're neutral. It's what you do with them that gets to be difficult. So James wants to talk about the damage that wealth can bring if you're not careful. He says, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and your moths have eaten your clothes. Weep and wail. Those are words that describe a shriek of terror. Something that confronts you that is so shocking and so hurtful that all you can do is shriek out loud and wail. Have you ever heard that kind of pain? When I was a boy, my Little League baseball coach had two sons. One was my age, his older brother was 3 years older than we were. But I do remember one day, the older brother was coming home from school, and there was another kid on the sidewalk who for some reason didn't like him, I guess, or didn't even like the way he looked at him. Maybe he just had a mean streak. I don't know what it was. But there on the sidewalk in front of the boy's home, this other boy knifed him to death. As he lay on the sidewalk, bleeding to death, his mother found him. We lived a block away. And I'll never forget, you could hear it a block away. The shriek of absolute terror and horror of holding the son dying for no good reason. He says that's the feeling that you're going to find because there's going to be this reversal. Because something is happening to your wealth. You have depended on your wealth so much, but he says your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. He said the gold and the silver is being corroded. It's being so tarnished it has no value anymore. The things that you hold precious are one day going to disappear. See, when you hold on to things so long that they're not worth anything, then what good are they? He said one of these days, God's going to take everything away, and there's going to be this reversal of fortune. And as rich as you were is as poor as you'll be. I always liked the story of the rich man and Lazarus. I liked it for many reasons, but one of them is simply this. There's a reversal of life. The rich man, when he dies, the interesting thing, he has no name, he's anonymous, but the rich man, when he dies, is sent to hell. But Lazarus, the beggar that nobody knows who he is, but God knows his name, goes to Abraham's bosom. There's a reversal. And everything you thought was valuable is now totally worthless. And the reason is, wealth has a corrosive effect on a soul. It is like acid that is poured on the soul that begins to eat away at it. The more you have, the worse you become. The more self-reliant you are, the less you rely on God. The more you have, the less you need God for. It's a very dear problem. And for many who are rich, they're finding their souls being eaten away a little at a time by the things they possess and the values that the riches have brought to them. Because you see, James says in James 5 and verse 3, their corrosion, listen, the corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. It has a corrosive effect. It will eat you alive. That's what the problem with dependence on wealth is. But how do you know? How do you know if it is causing a spiritual problem in your life? We would like for somehow to know for sure, because if Abraham can be wealthy, but the rich man and Lazarus is the same kind, but he has problems with, how do you know the difference? How do you know when riches are corroding your spirit? Well, James has 4 tests that we can look at this morning. The first test is a test called hoarding. Now, we all kind of think we know what hoarding is. We usually see houses are packed full of stuff that you can't even get around, and people die because the stacks fall over on them. People can't find them for days. until they're dead. Well, that's one kind of hoarding. But James says you have hoarded wealth in the last days. You have been storing this up, and that's the word, storing it up in a way to hold on to it. Now, he's not talking about saving money. Saving he doesn't condemn. After all, the Bible never condemns saving. In fact, it praises it. If you go by Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 25, the wise man Augur talks about the ant. And the wisdom of the ant is that ants are little creatures, are creatures of little strength, and yet they store up food in summer. They prepare for a day which they're going to need it. There's a legitimate use of savings. And that's not the same as hoarding. Hoarding, though, is collecting and holding on so tightly that you will not let it go for any reason. And you accumulate more and more, and you never share it, you never give it, you never use it, you just hold on to it. You see, the concept we can see easier in life. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, showering down on the city of Pompeii below it, volcanic ash and lava. It happened so suddenly that few could escape. Many were caught in the act of what they were doing and were in a sense mummified in action. There is the stone figure, a man who had been covered by the lava, who had the fork halfway to his mouth while he was eating. That's how fast he died. He couldn't even twitch the muscles. But perhaps one of the more fascinating one is a woman that they found the skeleton in 1981 that archaeologists have named the Ring Lady of Pompeii. They surmised this happened, that she had time to get out. She saw the coming devastation, but she was not going to leave her jewelry behind. So she went back to get her jewelry, but when it happened, the conflagration hit her and she was buried by the lava. And today, the skeleton remains with her with 2 rings on her fingers. She kept what she thought was valuable to lose what was more valuable. Or what about the miners, the gold miners of the Royal Charter? In 1859, the Royal Charter was a schooner that was coming back from Australia carrying gold miners who had been working the gold mines in Australia. As they approached the shore, the coast of Wales, a storm hit them suddenly and sank the vessel. All aboard, including all the miners, had died. But there are those who've studied the wreck and said the miners could have been saved, except for one thing. They had stuffed their pockets with so much of the gold that they had mined and refused to give it up, that they were so heavy that they sank with the ship and could not swim. And even to this day, there are reports that people along that same coastline of Wales will walk along the shore and they'll see something that glimmers. And it will be a piece of gold washed up by the surf from the decayed body of one of the miners who could not let go of his riches to save his own life. That is hoarding. When you hold on for something that seems so valuable but is not really that valuable, even at the cost of your life, especially at the cost of your soul. Why would anybody do that? Because they think the only value in life is what you have and not who you are. So James says you have been hoarding. And that shows that wealth has wrapped itself around your neck and is strangling you. But the second test, he goes on to say, is withholding. He says in verse 4, he said, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. Now the background of that is very simple. A man would be employed for a day. They were day laborers, and at the end of the day, they would be paid the day's wage. And so a man would collect his wages, and on his way back to his small home, he would buy the bread for the daily meal. It'd be probably the only meal that he and his children would eat. And if he got there and was the boss refused to pay him, he and his family would starve. It was such a problem that it was written into the code of Leviticus. And Moses told him, said, do not defraud. Listen to the words. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back wages of a hired man overnight. This was absolutely forbidden because it was a matter of life and death. But if you have the money in your pocket and you can hold it for another day, why should you give it away now? I can withhold from you to keep it for me. You say, well, we don't do it like that anymore. Are you sure? I knew a man one time who had his fence stained. Now, he was the kind, he was cheap. And cheap is probably the kind way of putting it about his character. And when the man came to collect his money, he said, look at that fence, it's a mess. I expected something far better than this. I don't think I'll pay you for this job. And he slammed the door in his face. Now, eventually the man got his job, got his money because he had someone come and collect it for him. But just think about it. You owe money to someone that you don't pay. Are there bills that you don't pay because you have something better to do with your money? You know, there are people like that. In one of the churches I served, I remember a knock came on the door, and that usually meant one thing: somebody needed some money. Where we were was a highway toward the coast, and sure enough, that was the case. It was a woman who had a baby on her hip. The baby was crying, and she said, I need some money. I need to be able to feed my child and buy some diapers. We're running short. Well, I glanced around. I saw that she had arrived in a pickup truck driven by her husband. A very nice pickup truck, a very large pickup truck, one that would be very valuable. And so I gave her the money, but also told her this: you need to go tell your husband that if he has a child that is hungry, he needs to sell that truck so he can buy that child what it needs to survive. And I'm not going to give you any more money until that happens. Now, she told him in the truck, and he gave me an interesting little salute, as you can imagine. But there's the problem. The riches get a hold of you because you're going to keep it for yourself. If you find yourself not paying your bills because you want to use the money for something personal, James says, be careful. It's beginning to drip acid on your heart. But the third test is that of being self-indulgent. He says in verse 5, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. Now listen to those two words. We think we know what they are. Luxury is a simple word that means to break down. And what it means by the connotation, what it comes over to mean is you have been sitting on your backside so long your muscles have gotten flabby. They've broken down. That's luxury. You would find corpulent people who had a lot of money because they had servants who did everything for them. They didn't have to move a muscle, and therefore their muscles would become flabby and hardly existent, it seemed. They grew soft by their living. And the question we have to ask is, are we growing soft by our living? We live in a very affluent society in which we can have a lot of things done for us, and we begin to expect it. And the luxuries of life we begin to take for granted, and not just take for granted, but them to become standard for us. Just take for church, for instance. When you walk into church, we expect the pews to be padded, don't we? And the thicker the better. The softer the better. And we expect the air conditioner to work in July and the heat to work in December. Why? Because we want to be comfortable. We can't worship when we're not comfortable. Putting it mildly, we need to be soft. Is that a problem? Perhaps, perhaps not. But he goes on to say, not only did you live in luxury, you lived in self-indulgence. That's a very ugly word. We don't like to use it very often. We usually talk about some wealthy frat boy who gets himself in trouble as being self-indulgent. But be very careful about that word. It doesn't mean what you think it means. In fact, the word comes over into English in the form of the name of a fungus. There's a fungus that grows in the forests of France. And people will go out with buckets and they'll collect these fungus. And they'll come back into town and they'll sell them in the market and they'll sell them for a lot of money. Do you know what they're called? Truffles. You know what the word for self-indulgent is James uses? The same base that we get the word truffle from. A truffle is expensive because it's a delicacy. It's an indulgence that you can't afford to do except on special occasions. Is your life full of truffles? He said you have been living in this self-indulgence where you please yourself at any and all cost. You will make yourself as soft and as comfortable as you can. And you won't care about anybody else or anything else. But then he goes on, he says, and he compares them to cattle. He says you've lived on this earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. If you go to the feedlot, they've got the animals strapped in. And they give them a constant diet of high-quality corn. Why? Because the more they eat, the fleshier they become. The fleshier they become, the more tender the meat is, and the more valuable it becomes, so that when they go to slaughter, they're worth a lot more money. You fatten them up to get them to slaughter. And James says the slaughter will come one day in the form of judgment. He said, but in the meantime, you're fattening yourself up. I want you to think about our lifestyle in our country, even Christians. Are you aware that in 2020, there were 21 million cookbooks sold? Now, 2020 was a unique year, I know. Everybody's baking bread. They wanted to bake all kinds of bread. You couldn't find flour, you couldn't find yeast. I remember looking. And you just couldn't find it. And everybody was baking. And they wanted to fix this and fix that. And so cookbooks were selling like crazy. Well, in the same year, 5 million diet books were sold. Just think about it. We buy the cookbook so we can eat so much that we get so miserable we have to go on a diet. And once we lose the weight, we know we can cook again and gain the weight back. And then we can go on another diet. And we go through the cycle of feeding and fasting. Because we feed ourselves. We like that. That's the self-indulgence that he talks about. We're also a nation that's consuming ourselves to death. I want you to look at the map on your screen right now. This is a graphic representation of obesity in America as in effect in the end of the year 2019. This map shows various colors, but if you'll hone in on the state of Texas, the place where we live, our home state, about a third of the entire population of the state of Texas is obese. Not large, not overweight, obese, to the point that will cause heart attacks and health problems. Now, we're a little better than some, going north of the Red River, for instance. And now it jumps to over 35%. Aren't we consuming ourselves to death? Aren't we using the good that we have to destroy ourselves? But see, that's the physical part. James says it's happening spiritually too. We give in to ourselves so much and become so soft that we no longer think about God, only ourselves, and pleasing ourselves. But the fourth is apathy, the suffering. He says in verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the innocent one, the one who was not opposing you. Now that can mean a lot of things, but I doubt if you were to ask them, have you murdered anyone? They would go, no, I haven't murdered anybody. I have not taken a life. Are you sure you didn't club someone to death? No, I didn't club anyone to death. Are you sure you didn't stab someone? No, I didn't stab anyone. Then how in the world could he say they murdered him? Well, one way may be that they took everything they had in court. But I want you to think about this for a moment, from James's perspective, from all the things that James has said. How in the world did they kill someone if they didn't physically kill them personally? Let's go back to chapter 2. In the passage in which James talked about faith and action, and how some people see faith as important without action and action without faith, he says that's impossible. He has this in verse 15. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but knows nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? Now the question is, was that just a hypothetical in James's mind, or was he thinking about something specific? If you take that passage and bring it to chapter 5, it might make more sense. Here you have the rich walking through town with the ability to relieve the suffering around them. They would come to the beggar who was begging, who was on their last lap, if you will. The life was oozing out of them. And they beg, and he could help them. He wouldn't even hurt by helping them. But instead, he looks at him and said, well, have a good day, and walks on by them. And he does absolutely nothing for them, and they die. Let me ask you the question. If he could do something to stop a death simply by helping financially, and you refuse to do it, are you not responsible for that death? Are you not guilty of helping to kill that person? See, James, I think, maybe being in a clever way of accusing people of, you have neglected people to death. You've walked by so many people that your wealth could have helped, that your wealth could have saved, that your wealth could have saved a baby that was dying of malnutrition, and yet you didn't do anything. Isn't there blood on your hands? But as we come to the end of this, James doesn't condemn the rich for being rich. He has nothing about someone who has money, who has financial resources. Instead, he's looking inside of their life, and he asks a single question. Is the wealth and the riches that you have keeping you away from what God wants you to be? Is it corroding your spirit? Or anything that damages your spirit becomes wrong by using it that way. Matthew chapter 19, Jesus met a young man. He was a good man. He's a man who liked self-improvement. He wanted to be a better man, in fact. So he comes to Jesus and he said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? It's a good question. It's the right question. It's the one everybody ought to ask. And so Jesus says, well, keep the commandments. And he said, well, I've been doing that from my youth up. And Jesus looked at him carefully. The sumptuous robe, the well-fed body, perhaps the ring on the finger. And he said, this one thing you lack. Go, sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and then come follow me. The man lowered his gaze. He quietly turned. Matthew says that when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. Then Jesus tells his disciples, truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. And it's not because they are rich. It is because they have now excluded God, because he is not as important as their riches. So there's a single question I'd like to ask you in the end. How much do you need? It was a question Leo Tolstoy wanted to ask, so he wrote a little short story called How Much Land Does a Man Need? It's a story of a peasant named Pahom, a Russian peasant who dreams about being wealthy. And one day he boasted to his wife, he said, if we had a big enough piece of property, I could even make the devil envious. At night the devil comes to him and he said, I'll take you up on your wager. So let me tell you something. He said, I will give you all the land you can walk around in a day if you will make the complete circuit. But if you don't make it, I claim your life and you claim your soul. Pahom accepted the wager. So he began the next day to plot out his course. He looked at all the property in town and he found the perfect piece of property. It was a large property. It would make him the most prosperous landholder in all of the village. He would become the most important man in town, the wealthiest, the one everyone would envy, the one everyone would look up to. And he knew what it would take to get it. And so he plotted the course, became very careful. He would need to be here at this station at this time and there at this station at this time. And early the next morning, when it came time for the challenge, he arose early and he made his place to the waiting line, the starting spot, to which he would have to return in order to win. As the sun breached the horizon at dawn, he began his walk. He was deliberate. He was careful. He walked, and he walked, and he walked, and he walked. As he walked and it became midday, he began to get real concerned. He was a little behind on his schedule. And so he picked up his pace. He walked faster. By 3 o'clock, he was seriously behind, and he began to run slowly and gently, loping as he went, thinking maybe he could make up the time. But the sun was falling quick. It was becoming sundown, and he was not there. So he broke into a full-fledged run. And he ran as fast as he could and as hard as he could. And he was almost back to the beginning line to make the circuit. As the sun was just about to fall below the horizon, he collapsed and died, just short of fulfilling the circuit. And the servants came, and they took him to the graveyard where they buried him in a grave. And Tolstoy asked the question, how much land does a man really need? And he said, one that's 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. The size of a grave. And perhaps James would ask exactly the same thing of us. How much do you really need? Thank you for joining me. I'm glad you joined me today, and I've always enjoyed being with you. And so next week we'll move on in James chapter 5. Thanks again, and have a good day.